I'm actually very happy to be speaking after Patrick because he's introduced a lot of the topics that I've also been thinking about in the recent years. I was like him, I started my career as a logician, looking at kind of very abstract circumstances of conversation and dialogue. And as I, developed in my research over the years, I started being more and more interested in like real life cases, in the messy world where there are lots of power differentials going on, where humans have cognitive limitations. So this is where at this point I decided I really need to kind of do kind of the real, a more realistic account of our argumentative processes. And this was this project called the Social Epistemology of Argumentation, which was generously funded by the European Research Council. It has already finished by now almost 2 years ago officially, but now the book, where I summarize the main findings of the project, is finally coming out. So basically, I'm starting my book tour, right? So this is in the spirit of doing a book tour, and I'll be telling you about the book. Originally in my abstract, I was kind of very generous. I'm going to tell you about my main results in a very kind of encompassing way, but now I'm actually going to focus into one of the chapters of the book to make it manageable, right? To make it fit within the time that I have. So this is the book. It already has a cover. It already has a website, but it's not quite ready yet. It's supposed to come out next year. This year, next academic year, somewhere in November, I'm told, maybe before. So the book is called Reason and Power in Argumentation. And what it does is to investigate the limits of rational argumentation. So I'm interested in how rational argumentation can and cannot achieve, especially in view of in realistic situations where we're dealing with power structures and with the cognitive limitations of human reason, human beings. And I'm not denying that reason has power, right? So I'm not completely kind of forgetting that I once upon a time was a logician and, studied the relation of support between premises and conclusion. I acknowledge that reason has powers, that arguments have power. Here I use the phrase by Jung and Habermas, the unforced force of the better argument. So there is, good arguments do have force, but the power of reasons is just one type of power that permeates these social realities. And that's why I was really happy with Patrick's talk before me, because he really kind of gave a really nice introduction and a couple of examples of exactly this kind of phenomena happening. And so the power of the other kinds of powers that undercut the power of reasons are things like strategic power, economic power, political power, epistemic, social, even emotional power. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to treat all of them here today, but that's kind of the big picture of the book. What I'll focus on instead is a specific topic. I'll focus on the topic of vaccine hesitancy, which of course is a very pressing problem still now. It was particularly prominent during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's still very much a very serious public health issue. And this is where one of the domains where it seems, at least, that the force of the better argument does not always prevail, right? So in debates about vaccines. So on the one hand, there's overwhelming scientific evidence proving that vaccines, on the whole, by and large, are very safe, are very efficient. And yet, over the last decades, there has been this explosion of vaccine hesitancy increasing in many different places in the world. And what I'll say, or to kind of already anticipate, give you the spoiler of the whole talk, is that the vaccine hesitancy is not a phenomenon that pertains to scientific illiteracy. It's not about a lack of scientific knowledge on the part of the public. Rather, it's primarily a matter of trust. And here I want to mention a philosopher, Maya Goldenberg, by the way, Canadian philosopher, so paying my respects to the country. And she wrote the whole book exactly on this, on how trust is really essential on debates about vaccine hesitancy. So I'll be drawing also on her work, but then I'll be placing this idea in the broader kind of conceptual framework that I developed with my team to think about argumentation in more realistic situations. So first, I'll tell you a bit about this framework that I developed, so the conceptual framework of reasoning, power, and argumentation. Then I'll tell you about vaccine hesitancy, and I'll do this by giving you a couple of examples of real people talking about their own process of becoming vaccine hesitant and then going back to being pro-vax. And then I will, the framework introduced in part 1 to the phenomenon of vaccine hesitancy. So let's start with the book. The key idea of the book is to take literally the description of argumentation as a form of exchange. So this is something that we hear people saying. Often, I think they probably mean metaphorically. So John Stuart Mill would say something like this. Philosopher Alvin Goldman would say something like this. But I took this seriously, literally. And what that allowed me to do is to then look into the social science of exchanges to then inform my research, my inquiry with, empirically grounded findings about how relations of exchange actually take place in the world. And I was very lucky because there was already a very robust framework that already existed called social exchange theory. It's been developed by sociologists and social psychologists. It's been around since the 1950s, so it's been around for a long time. And it's also very much inspired by anthropology. And so this framework focuses, very much looks into the role of, yes, Mauss, exactly. Somebody wrote there that there's Mauss. That's exactly right. There's Marcel Mauss in the background. And this theory focuses in particular very much on the role of power in these social relations. So it was perfect for me because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to look into the effects of power relations in argumentative processes. So just to give you an idea what social exchange means, I have here 2 quotes from a book by one of the pioneers of this framework, a sociologist called Peter Blau. And he says the following: social exchange refers to voluntary actions of individuals that are motivated by the returns they are expected to bring and typically do in fact bring from others. A little further, he says, it involves the principle that one person does another a favor, and while there is a general expectation of some future return, its exact nature is definitely not stipulated in advance. So it's important to understand that social exchange theory was developed as a response to hyper-utilitarian accounts of human sociality, right? So this idea that, of the homo economicus, who's always very individualistically trying to maximize the payoffs. And instead, this framework looks at the diachronic relations of exchange that people engage in. There's like this kind of back and forth, right? So I do something for you this week, you do something for me next week, and on the whole, it kind of tends to more or less to equality, but it's not stipulated in advance. So it's different from a commercial transaction. So that's the key idea. And the thought is that this general idea of social exchange, where the foundation is really the concept of reciprocity, that this general idea of reciprocity is present in many different cultures, right? So it's just quite cross-culturally quite robust as well. So on the basis of the literature from social exchange theory, with my team, we developed this model, which is meant to describe the structure of exchanges. It's kind of the model that a logician would come up with. So that's why, in a sense, I'm still kind of, drawing on my own background as a logician. So now I have this model which distinguishes 3 different stages in the exchanges, in these processes of exchange. And in particular, the first 2 stages are really what happens before the exchange actually takes place. So these are the conditions of possibility for an exchange to happen at all, right? And the first level has to do with the opportunity structure. It has to do with the structure of the network, of who has access to whom in the network, who then can become a potential exchange partner for each of the individuals in the network. The second stage has to do with the contrastive assessments that people make. So among the many different partners that I could potentially exchange with, who do I view as a worthy exchange partner? And then it's only in the third level that the actual exchange occurs. So that's, with these three levels, then there's a lot of kind of, it really helps us kind of understand, at least analytically, these different processes. In practice, of course, there's kind of feedback loops between the different levels. So I'm not saying that they're completely isolated from each other, but it's for theoretical purposes, it's useful to distinguish these three levels, these three stages in the process. And so to, make it more concrete to you. So now, until now, I'm talking about exchanges that are completely general, any kind of exchange that can include, workflow relationships. It can include romantic relationships. It can include pretty much anything. But then what I do in the book is then to look more specifically at epistemic exchanges, right? So I understand epistemic exchanges as exchanges that involve epistemic resources. It does not only involve epistemic resources, it can also involve all kinds of resources, but there's always epistemic resources involved. That's what makes these exchanges epistemic exchanges. And argumentation is one type of epistemic exchange. There are other types of epistemic exchange, but that's the one that I was interested in the book. So here now looking at epistemic exchanges, right? So now we're zooming in. We're not talking about other types of exchanges. We're talking about me bringing, my neighbor needs eggs and then my neighbor borrows eggs from me and next week I borrow sugar from them. So I'm not talking about those types of exchanges anymore, even though they also fit the general story. Now I have, so these three stages, how do they translate in terms of epistemic exchanges? The first one, so here I have these diagrams. And here for simplicity, I have one main agent in the middle and the other ones around. Whereas, of course, the actual networks, like a very complicated networks with people related to each other in multiple ways. So this is just for simplicity. So this main agent in the middle. And then who is a potential exchange partner for the agent in the middle? And this has to do, when it comes to epistemic exchanges, it has to do with relations of attention. Who do I pay attention to and who pays attention to me? So here, imagine in this kind of to the left here, the diagram to the left, imagine that, it's me in the middle, and then around me are all the potential newspapers that I could possibly read on a given day. But many of them, I don't even know they exist, right? So I don't have access to them. Maybe I don't even read the language. So, it's already out of the range of potential exchange partners. And here, these would be D and G, right? You see that there's no dotted line between me and these two. Whereas the other agents around me, I pay sufficient attention to them that they could become potential exchange, they could become exchange partners for me. Then in the second level, that's when I'm making contrastive assessments between the different agents. And here I represented it as a binary assessment. So either, worth exchanging with or not. Right above some relevant threshold, but this can also be a ranking, right? I could also go like, this is my most preferred agent, my second one, my third one. And here, so I have like the full lines, they represent that I consider newspapers B, C, and F to be worthy of engaging with. They have good enough epistemic resources to offer. I think I can trust them as sources of information. And then eventually in the third level, I then actually go and exchange with with a subset of those that I deemed sufficiently good as exchange partners. It can be typically will be a proper subset because there are more exchange partners that I consider good enough than that I can actually go and exchange with for reasons of limitations of cognitive limitations of time. So there are more newspapers in the world that I consider, okay, that I could potentially read, then I have time in a given day to read. So in that sense, in the third level, then it becomes an even narrower range of agents with whom I actually go on an exchange. And here's the thicker lines, that's B and C. So that's the model, basically. So that's really, what does the whole, all the work in the book. Details of this model, if you don't want to wait for the book to come out, you can already look at this paper, which was published in the journal Informal Logic, another Canadian venerable institution. So pay my respects again. And so this paper came out already quite a few years ago, and it really has all the details and also how I'm drawing on social exchange theory. So you can go and check it out. So very quick mention of power, right? So I mentioned at the beginning, that's even in the title of the book, Reason and Power and Argumentation. That's what I'm interested in. You can ask me, what do you mean by power, right? So what notion of power are you taking as operative in your book? It's broadly a Foucaultian notion of power. And what this means is that, Foucault's notion of power is not that power is only about domination and oppression. So for him, power is not necessarily a bad thing, right? And power is always relational. It's always, goes in both directions, but potentially in an asymmetric way, right? And so here I have a quote, a famous quote by Foucault: power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. So it's constitutive of these networks of relationships, okay? It's not just destructive, it's also productive. And just to give you an analogy, the way I think about power in this Foucaultian way is like as a vector space of forces, like a classical mechanic. Right? There are these different forces and some like kind of neutralize the other, but it's very kind of, it's a diffuse network. And then just to clarify this idea that it's relational, so if you think about gravity, right? So you have the earth and the sun. We usually think, well, it's only the sun exercising gravity over the earth, right? That's why we're rotating around the sun. But actually, that's not true. The earth is also exercising gravity over the sun. It's just that because the sun is so much bigger, the gravity effect of the earth upon the sun is negligible, right? But it's there, okay? So that's the general idea. I'm not going to go into the details of the power component so much, but I'll be happy to talk about it later if people are interested in that. So just give you a quick overview of the chapters, right, and the structure of the book. Part 1 is the kind of theoretical part. That's where the model is presented. I call it AX model, argumentation as exchange. And so it starts with this general overview of the literature, and that people disagree. Some people think that irrational arguments are great, others think that they're horrible. So what gives there? And then in chapter 2, I introduce the theoretical framework, also drawing on Marcel Mauss, who was mentioned in the chat, and also more recently the work also of David Graeber, the anthropologist. And so that's the theoretical chapter, and there I introduced the 3 levels that I was just telling you about. And then chapters 3, 4, and 5, they look at each of the levels of the 3 levels. And in this talk, I'm going to look particularly at chapter 4. So that's the chapter that has to do with the assessment, right? So how you assess different potential exchange partners. And what I say in this chapter is that a very, very important component of these processes of assessment is trust. Okay, so that's the thought, that trust is very important for argumentation. And that's what I'm going to be telling you about. Just to give you a sense of what I do in the rest of the book. So then in part 2, I look at 4 different kind of applications of the model. Chapter 6 looks at scientific argumentation. Chapter 7 at political argumentation. Chapter 8, argumentation and conspiracies. And chapter 9 looks at argumentation online. Okay? So, and like the things I'm going to tell you about today all kind of relate to each of these 4 chapters as well. So also happy to talk about it. So now let's look at vaccine hesitancy. And here, as I announced, I'm going to use anecdotal evidence, and very deliberately, okay? And so in the book, I make this choice with a kind of example, a narrative of something that actually happened, right? So like a real story of a person or some people or some situation. So I'm very, I dislike very much this kind of like, style and analytic philosophy, analytic epistemology of coming up with these, fictional vignettes to make up a philosophical point. I don't like that. The whole point of the book was to introduce a more realistic account of argumentative processes. So I use real case examples. One of the reviewers for the book, for the press, said, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's not very scholarly, this book, because there are all these anecdotes. And so, which, of course, eventually the reviewer themselves said, well, that's probably the point. I'm like, yes, that is the point. It's deliberate. Because I wanted to really to make it concrete. And that's why Patrick's talk before me was great, right? Because he was using all these concrete examples of real people, real stories, like things that actually happened to illustrate the philosophical points he was making. That's what I'm going to do as well. So let me tell you, right? So first about vaccine hesitancy in general. This is, by the way, the cover of Maya Goldenberg's book. I recommend it very much. And so for much of the 20th century, there's been great progress with vaccines. Polio, measles, smallpox, right? So smallpox has been eradicated. It's the first time that a human disease is eradicated thanks to vaccines. But then in 1998, there was an article that was published, spurious article by somebody called Andrew Wakefield, who was until then a respected medical researcher. And in this paper, he claimed that there was an association between vaccines and autism. So probably all of you have heard of this already. Some 10 years later, a bit more than 10 years later, the paper was retracted. It became apparent that there were lots of misconducts involved. In fact, he had been paid by lawyers who then wanted to, like put up a class action case against pharmaceutical companies, right? So that the clients would kind of get compensation for the kid having gotten autism after having been vaccinated. So it was a scam through and through. And yet it had a big impact. Right? So it really kind of reverberated primarily like in the general public. So this is, of course, one factor, which I think was an important one, but it's not the whole story. Of course, there are other factors involved in the growth of vaccine hesitancy in recent decades related to distrust towards scientific institutions, trust erosion in general, populist politics. So there, I'm not saying that it's just the Wakefield article that caused it, but it was an important trigger for the whole thing as well. So now let me tell you about people, right? Actual people who had this experience. So first of them, it's a mother called Lydia Green, who then said in a radio show, she said the following, right? She was talking about like how she had first herself grew up being vaccinated, and then she got her first kid. She was not planning on not vaccinating the kid, but then the kid got a vaccine and then was very fussy in the night, right? So it happens with kids, when they get vaccines, they feel like sick and they sometimes get a fever. So it's perfectly normal. But she was very anxious. This was her first child. So then this is what happens, right? So now I cite her. So I called the public health nurse after being up all night with her, with the baby. And I was like, listen, I just think something's really wrong. She's crying so much and it's worrying me. She doesn't want to nurse. And then the nurse, or like the public health nurse, says, I am Lydia Green's.
Not much we can do is turn Wi-Fi.
This is connection.
Connection.
So this is.
Because onvergevegen. Alvast is maar.
Your mic is off.
Yes?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you. So she felt brushed off, so she went online and then she got into all these groups with moms who first were like super nice to her and really, were very understanding and supportive. But then also started saying, yeah, actually vaccines are, really dangerous. So this is basically what happened. And this is a very common story. Many people had precisely this kind of experience, right? So then she felt validated in these online forums where these other mothers criticized the vaccines. And then she also started doing in her words, doing her own research. This went on when the COVID pandemic hit. She connected with a pediatrician who was pro-vaccine, but who was very respectful of her, right? Really engaged with her with scientific information, but also like really kind of showing understanding. And so it was really important that she could connect with this particular person, with this pediatrician, who she felt was respecting her, right? She felt respected and acknowledged by this particular pediatrician. So the summary is that scientific arguments play the role. Okay, yeah, I can turn off my video. Yes.
Yes, yes, if you turn your video up, we can stabilize your
yes, sorry
section.
again. Okay, so now I have to be like extra lively in what I say, right, to keep you all awake.
Okay.
All right, so then she, right, still not working?
Yes, it works.
Can you hear me?
I'm adjusting the subtitles.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me continue then. Right, so scientific arguments did play a role in her change of mind, right, and how she revised her beliefs about vaccines, but she needed to hear them from someone who seemed to care about her. So this was really important, right? So this particular pediatrician. And this again is something that we see in a lot of these narratives. So here's another one. This is another mother called Tara Hills. And here's she's also describing her process of how she kind of, moved from being pro-vaxxer to anti-vaxxer, and then afterwards she changed back. She says, doubts had been sown in my mind from various sources, from conversations with new moms during play dates who expressed concerns or even chose to delay and or opt out of vaccination altogether, to the information influx on the internet. What if there was truth being suppressed by harmless pharmaceutical companies who could not care less about my child over another profitable quarter? What if even doctors were being misinformed and used to connect with the blindly trusting public? The narrative of suspicion and distrust was easy to accept in our age of information overload. This is what Tara Hill's own description of the process that she went through, right? The epistemic process. So then this person, she became then an anti-vaxxer, her terms again, and she started seeking online communities where she found, in her words, warmth, welcome, compassion, understanding, and respect. Right? But then two things happened that made her change her mind again, back to being pro-vax. First, she connected with a friend of a friend who was pro-vax, who then also again engaged with her, treated her with what she felt was respect. She says, this person treated me with basic dignity and respect by acknowledging that it's hard to make so many critical decisions on behalf of our kids. Right? So here, there's really this idea, right? Look, it's understandable that you feel so anxious, and these are very difficult decisions. And so that's one thing that happened. And the second thing that happened was that a whooping cough epidemic hit Hill's family. She had 7 kids, like a lot of kids. So just imagine the disaster that this was. I mean, whooping cough is a terrible disease. And that's what really made her change her mind again. Okay, so these are like the two anecdotes that have like a similar pattern. So now back to the theory, right? So now I'm going to apply my overall framework, the general framework. I'm going to apply it specifically to these cases, and I'm going to be looking particularly into the second tier, right? So just to remind you, the tier that has to do with assessment, okay? So I'm going to be looking at the role of trust and argumentation. So this general idea, right? So the questions pertaining to how trust features into epistemic exchanges, this is obviously not something that, that I'm the first one to discuss. And one reference that's been very useful for me is this 2010 paper by Sperber and colleagues called Epistemic Vigilance. And so there they describe epistemic vigilance, the concept of epistemic vigilance in the following terms. Humans massively depend on communication with others, but this leaves them open to the risk of being accidentally or intentionally misinformed. To ensure that, despite this risk, communication remains advantageous, humans have, we claim, a suite of cognitive mechanisms for epistemic vigilance. Right? So epistemic vigilance is a broad umbrella term. And then they say, epistemic vigilance can be directed at the source of communicated information, right? So the person providing the information. Is the communicator competent and honest? But it can also be directed at the content of the communication, right? So the propositional content being transmitted, which may be more or less believable independently of this source, right? So these are two different ways of assessing, content that's transmitted to you. And what they say there is, which is something that I then disagree with, they say that argumentation can be precisely a response to the problem of low trust, right? So if you don't trust the informant very much, but then this informant can give you a good argument, then that can overcome the trust bottleneck, as they put it. I disagree with that, because I'm going to say that if you don't trust the source, you're not even going to bother to engage with the content of the argument. And not only is this a descriptive claim, right, that in fact people don't actually go and engage with the argument if they don't trust the source, I'm also saying that this is a normative claim, right? So I'm saying it's rational for people to do that. So I'm going to explain that now. So first, let me be clear what I mean by trust. Of course, there are many notions of trust all around. So in social exchange theory, right, the theory I was telling you about in the beginning, trust is a very important concept. And here's one definition that's offered in this literature. Trust is conceptualized as an expectation that an exchange partner will behave benignly and not exploitatively, based on inferences about the partner's traits and intentions, right? So what you think that, is the person not opportunistic? Is the person also, in the case of epistemic resources, is the person also knowledgeable? This is something that's discussed in many different fields. So there's one very, very influential paper in organization sciences, or it's kind of management. It's this Meyer et al. 1995 paper, where they present this integrative model of trust, which has three components: ability, benevolence, and integrity. In my model, right, so what I do is I call competence, that's what they call ability, and I put benevolence and integrity together into benevolence, right? So I don't distinguish between benevolence and integrity. So basically, trust has these two components. It has the epistemic component of competence, and it has the moral, ethical, political component of benevolence, or lack thereof. And the point is that for you to trust, to be able to trust somebody, right, for you to consider the person trustworthiness, both factors need to be present. You need to consider the person both competent and benevolent, right? And if one of them fails, then the person is not considered trustworthy. So, right, so I just said this, right? So for an informant to be considered trustworthy, both the competence and the benevolence conditions must obtain. And then people typically, as a matter of fact, people refuse to engage with arguments that come from sources that they perceive as incompetent or malevolent. So this is a descriptive claim. And I'm saying here, typically, I'm not saying always the case. Sometimes people think I'm doing the analytic philosophy game of giving necessary and sufficient conditions, and then they come up with a very far-fetched counterexample. That's not the game I'm playing, right? Ceteris paribus, pro tanto, people typically refuse to engage with arguments coming from untrustworthy sources. But I'm also going to make the normative claim that it is actually rational for people to do this, to refuse to engage with the arguments from what they perceive as an untrustworthy source. And why is that? Because, first of all, you need to make choices. Remember that I said at the beginning, I don't have cognitive resources that allow me to, engage with all the possible sources around me, especially in like a hyper-saturated informational environment. So I need to make choices. And it makes, of course, a lot of sense that you spend your precious cognitive resources and time with sources that you can consider to be, trustworthy, having something useful to tell you. And secondly, there's the problem of deception, right? So maybe somebody's intentionally trying to deceive you. But, the point is, like, we know, and I think that's something that a lot of philosophers still don't want to admit, but we are not very good at evaluating the cogency of arguments except on topics that are very narrowly of our own expertise. So this is a point that was also made by the philosopher New Levy a few years ago with his book, Bad Beliefs, right? For the most part, we're just lay people, we're just novices, so we're not in a position to evaluate the quality of the argument itself, right? So think about the vaccine cases that I was telling you about. There's a lot of scientific literature saying that they're safe, but I don't know about enough about epidemiology to be able to say, well, this is a good argument, this is not a good argument. I just need to defer to the experts. So that's the general story, right? So it's rational to just, pay more attention to the arguments, or even only attention to the arguments of people that you consider trustworthy. That means both competent and benevolent. But here's the catch. We're also not very good at reliably assessing the trustworthiness of other people, right? So we're a bit in a bind here, right? It's so I need to defer. If I need to defer to others on topics that I'm not knowledgeable about, by hypothesis, right? I don't have the required expertise. And let me just check if there's something in the chat. Oh yeah, 10 minutes. Yes, I'm almost done. Great. So by a hypothesis, right? I don't know enough about the topic. If I did, I wouldn't have to look at somebody else's argument, right? I would make up my mind myself. So I know too little about the topic to be able to judge. If that's the case, right, that I'm not sufficiently competent on the topic, then that means I'm probably also not competent to judge whether that person really is an expert, right? And because, of course, as we know, markers of expertise can be faked, right? It happens all the time. There are like these people who claim they have like all these fancy diplomas and they've done all these things, and then people start digging up, and then it turns out that it was all fake. So, for example, there was this guy, what's his name, Santos, this representative in the US, right, who had this like whole fantastic story of how he had done all these amazing things, and people started digging, and of course, none of that was true. But for a while, he fooled a couple of people there. Moreover, markers of benevolence can also be fake. People can also pretend that they really care about you. And in situations where you're already feeling vulnerable, remember that the first mother that I was talking about, right? She had spent the night awake with a baby who's crying. She's like very overwhelmed, and she's very kind of, insecure about herself. And then she calls the nurse. She feels brushed off by the nurse. Instead, then she turns to these communities online, and then they seem to be really nice to her, right? And maybe some of them were like genuinely also themselves also believers, but there's also a lot of opportunism, right? So they're also the entrepreneurs, like the people who really exploit the vulnerability that people feel in certain situations, and then really kind of, take advantage of that. So this is the problem. The problem is we need to trust experts, we need to trust others, also in cases where, with their arguments, but we're not very good at identifying the right experts to trust. So, and again, this is also a point that was made quite eloquently by the philosopher T.N. Wen. I recently listened actually to his book called The Score. It's a great, great book. So I recommend, and also it's on his own voice. He recorded the audiobook. So, if you want the details of that, check that out. So let me just, I'm almost done. So back to vaccine hesitancy, to these two cases that I was describing. So these two mothers, they had two sets of conflicting advice. Some people saying that they should vaccinate their kids, and other people saying that they should not vaccinate their kids. And then, so how would they, they were in that position of, like in my diagrams at the beginning, there was somebody in the middle and the different sources around them. So what should they do? So they probably did not per se they didn't doubt the competence of the medical establishment, but they very much doubted their benevolence, right? So there's this, of course, this whole narrative of big pharma, which is also by and large true, right? That big pharma is greedy, et cetera, et cetera. So that they doubted the benevolence of those sources, and they thought maybe the doctors are, the medical doctors are themselves kind of part of, either deliberately part of the conspiracy, or else they're just also being fooled by the malevolent, conspirators. But in these online forums, they found people who were kind to them. So what they did was that they let their perceptions of benevolence trump their perceptions of competence. Right? So this is really what I think what happened there, that their perceptions of benevolence spoke more like loudly than their evaluations of competence. And they only changed their minds back to being pro-vaxxers when they met what they perceived as benevolent pro-vaxxers, people who really talked to them, who really took the trouble to kind of talk to them in a respectful way, you know, listening to their concerns and like kind of reassuring them that they were really trying their best. So that's why I think, you know, this is kind of one way to understand what's going on. And again, remember the point that that's already a point that Maya Goldenberg has made, now the role of trust and vaccine hesitancy. Now I'm just kind of elaborating on how this fits with my overall model. So contrary to like what I've said is that contrary to a common view, that is the view that the force of an argument should speak for itself. What I've been saying here is that trust or absence of trust in the source of an argument plays an important role in how we engage in arguments. And again, like I said, this is a descriptive and a normative claim. So the descriptive claim, people are probably, you know, not many people disagree with that, but it's of course the normative claim that's more component of benevolence is present even in exchanges that are primarily epistemic, right? You might say, oh no, let's separate the epistemic here and the political there, but of course this cannot be done. And again, this is also what the literature on epistemic injustice has been showing. So what I've also said is that at the same time, we're not well placed to identify trustworthiness accurately, both for competence and for benevolence. We use proxies, right? We use heuristics, but there's always the possibility of faked signals. So we find ourselves in this predicament. We must trust others, in particular experts, but it's very difficult to accurately identify whom we should trust. So this might be like a kind of skeptical conclusion. I don't see it that way. Happy to talk about it if some people feel this is kind of what comes out of my model. And I'm just going to finish here with a picture of my daughter being vaccinated during the pandemic. So you know where I stand. Thank you. Let me try to turn on my video now that I'm not sharing my screen. Let's see if this holds up.
Perfect. Thank you so much for speaking. We now have 15 minutes for questions from the audience. I will ask people to come to the front so she can see you and hear you properly.
No.
Changing the camera. You should see people once they get up to the front.
Yes.
Thanks for the really thought-provoking presentation. It was much appreciated. I want to raise a question about your view of Dan Spelberg.
You're breaking off a bit. Can you repeat?
Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. I know what happened. I'm not, just give me a second.
Can you hear me?
Just
Great, are you there? So, thanks a lot, Catarina. It was a much appreciated presentation. I want to ask a question on your view of Dan Spelberg and Hugo Mercier position. So with their epistemic vigilance, or for example, Hugo Mercier has shifted slightly from this like term epistemic vigilance by quoting it like open vigilance. There's the idea that they're like two-way oriented, both like towards openness so we can get new sources of information, and both like with the capacity to close when we deem the information source to be unreliable or not meriting our trust and our attention or our epistemic resources. So can you explain further a bit why you disagree with their position and what is the basis of your disagreement? If you can clarify that furthermore, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.
So, sure. Thanks. Yeah, so my disagreement is with the earlier work, indeed, right? So Hugo has now moved more, you know, in directions that are quite similar to mine. In fact, we often kind of, you know, are together in events, and he's seen me presenting this particular material, and he basically agreed with me, right? So I think at this point, he and I are much closer But with the epistemic vigilance model, the original one, the main difference, there wasn't like this sequential order that I described, right? So they thought that these things were happening in parallel, that you're engaging with the content and engaging and, assessing the trustworthiness of the source at the same time. Whereas I think that's my kind of like, substantive claim. I'm saying no. Okay. Oh yeah, let me try to turn off my camera again. Sorry about that, guys. So I'm trying here, but I'm on my 4G with my phone. So yeah, so the thought is that this is one of the things that I disagree with in terms of their model. They say that you would still engage with people who you take to be untrustworthy, but you still listen to their arguments because you feel like you're capable of assessing the correctness of that argument yourself. And I'm saying no, right? And again, descriptively and normatively, because very often we're not in a position to be able to tell whether the argument is good or not. I think that's a fundamental disagreement that I have with their earlier work. I think they're way too optimistic in their claims that we're very good at assessing the quality of arguments, like across all topics and across all things. And I'm much more suspicious of that. I think, very often we are not in a good position because the argument has all kinds of like question that we're not in a position to adjudicate on. So I see my connection is still unstable. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but sometimes it cuts off.
But in general,
Yeah,
it's
sorry
good.
about that.
It's
So
good.
then
It's good in
okay,
general.
good. Yes, thanks. Okay, sorry about not being able to turn on the camera.
No
Okay,
problem.
next question, maybe?
Questions in the room?
I think there were questions from the chat, but we're currently writing them as we speak. Pas pour le panel. The question is going to be in the panel after. Questions from the room?
Okay.
No. Then we can go to a short break and the next question. Oh, there's another question. Perfect.
It's me again. I don't know if you still can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. So basically, what I understand that you're contending is that the Dance-Perber model view or Hugo Mercier model view is far too optimistic in confiding trustworthiness and relatableness to the other position. But I feel they would have because in your model you
No, that's not exactly my point.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, that's not exactly
Okay.
my point, because and that's what I like about their models, because they also very much think about the possibility of deception, about opportunism. So, there's this element of hostility, and I like this, and I think this is very often missing in a lot of social epistemology, right? I like that part. Where I think I disagree, at least with their earlier work, is that they have a lot of faith in people being good at distinguishing good arguments from bad arguments, right? So this is something they say also in their book, the Enigma of Reason book. They say, well, people are pretty bad at producing good arguments, but they're pretty good at recognizing, adjudicating arguments produced by other people, whether they're good or bad, right? And this is where I disagree with them. I think that it will very much depend on the topic. For very simple arguments, simple cases, maybe. But if you have more complicated topics, then, like I said, the example, people give me evidence of the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and it's like a bunch of statistics and a bunch of, things that I don't understand. How am I, a non-expert in epidemiology or public health or virology and whatnot? How am I going to assess the cogency of those arguments? So that's where I think there's a disagreement. I hope you could hear me. I
so
hope it didn't
for
break
example,
off.
Oh, it's okay.
yeah, so if I can just go a bit further on this. So for example, contrasting their position with Sethi Nguyen and his hostile epistemology, saying there are hostile forces gaming heuristics to gain consent and gain like
Yeah,
salience. So I feel that there's a big part of like in
Yeah.
this model of trust that you propose of what's the name of the game of us and them. So like let's say political antagonism or not feeling like cared for or heard for. So like taking an extreme example, for example, you go in Tel Aviv and you're like, so what do you think of the Palestinian genocide? And it's like, it's probably gonna be
Yeah.
like not much like trust and confidence in your questions. Conversely is like same goes like for asking Palestinians like about like what do you think of what happened of the da 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 da. It's like in a very heated political
Yeah.
conflict. But for example, when you can build relatability and relatableness, the idea is that maybe in the
Exactly.
Sperber model, you would be lazy for adjudicating the value of your own arguments and your own beliefs, but you would be scrupulous in adjudicating the other people's argument and belief. So only the stronger arguments would pierce through your resistance, like in this kind of like antagonistic part of their
That's
model.
that's
What do
that's
you
his
think of
story.
like
Yeah, exactly. That's their model. I have a critical notice on their book. It appeared in the Journal of Mind and Language. So it's called actually The Enduring Enigma of Reason. And so I have detailed responses on what I disagree with respect to that book. But I think so. I was very much inspired by Tien Nguyen's work, and like again, I mentioned him already. And but I think he's too negative, right? So with this idea of hostile epistemology, there is still this idea that there's like this arms race of people who's kind of trying to deceive you, and you figure out ways to kind of escape from the deception, but they figure out again how to catch you in their deception. I think my story, my anthropological story, right, of these diachronic relationships of trust that are built over time are precisely an answer to the kind of, grim picture that comes out of Tien Nguyen's whole idea of hostile epistemology. So in that sense, I feel like I'm trying to strike a balance there. I take it on board, this idea of hostility very much, but I feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel, as it were, right? There's still things to hold on to and be optimistic about.
Okay, we'll have a 10 minutes break and we come back for the panel. Thank you so much, Catarina.